How do you balance work, family, moving, and a diagnosis of chronic Lyme disease? Ross Douthat will be here to talk about his new book, The Deep Places, a memoir of illness and discovery. What happens when a model-turned journalist heads to North Dakota to report on the oil boom in a divided America? Elizabeth Egan will join us to talk about Oh Beautiful, our November pick for group text. Liz Harris will be here to talk about what's going on in the publishing world. Plus, my colleagues and I will talk about what we're reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's November 19th. I'm Pamela Paul. Ross Douthat joins us now from New Haven. He is an opinion columnist for the New York Times, my colleague here. He was previously an editor at The Atlantic. He's the author of many books, including The Decadent Society, To Change the Church, Bad Religion, and Privilege. And his latest book is called The Deep Places, a memoir of illness and recovery. Ross, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
So you and I have never met, never spoken.
We've exchanged some excellent emails, though. So
yes,
I feel like
emailed.
I know you very well.
Right. In the way that the internet works, we are long-term acquaintances. So this is a really different book for you. It's a memoir. Let's start with before the book. What happened?
I guess the genesis of the book was a great folly where my wife and I, about almost 7 years ago now, were living in Washington, D.C., and we were both from New England, from Connecticut. Our families were up here. And we had this idea, and maybe it was sort of a special fantasy for me in particular, of getting out of the city, living in somewhere between the suburbs and the country, raising our kids, with fields and stone walls and chickens and all kinds of sort of urban dwellers' ideas of what people in the country have and enjoy and do. And we weren't the only people who had this fantasy, but unlike some of our friends, we actually decided to make it real. And so we sold our house in DC and plowed the money into this 1790s farmhouse about an hour and a half from New York with a barn and a pasture and all kinds of good things. And unfortunately, literally as we were in the process of making the move, I became very, very sick. And the first phase of that sickness while we were still in Washington was just sort of total mystery, where I basically became, over a matter of months, became just a shell of myself. I lost 40 pounds. I was sleeping an hour a night. I had bizarre pain all over my body, phantom heart attacks, went to the emergency room all the time, and nobody knew what was wrong with me. None of the doctors in DC. I probably saw 12 doctors, and basically, they all said, your blood tests look negative. You're probably under a lot of stress, and this is some sort of anxiety-induced condition. The only people who didn't think that were the psychiatrists I saw, interestingly, who said, no, this is almost certainly a physical problem, Ross, and you need to figure out what it is. And then when we got to Connecticut and literally sort of dragged ourselves there and collapsed in this dream house that was now a terrifying, crumbling, haunted house, then the doctors said, oh, no, we see this all the time. You almost certainly have Lyme disease, this tick-borne illness named for a couple cute antiquing towns on the Connecticut shoreline. And that's where I entered into the second world, which is the meat of the story of the book, which is the world of not medical mystery, but medical controversy.
All right, we're going to just do some Lyme disease basics for people who are not from Connecticut or, frankly, now all of New England, the Mid-Atlantic region, and probably much of the rest of the country where Lyme disease lurks. I take it that you walked into a field or even just grass at some point during this process of buying a house in Connecticut?
It was a very overgrown property, and we did the house inspection, and I literally walked down to the field and pushed aside branches, and I saw a herd of deer. And Lyme disease is, of course, carried by the deer tick. So almost certainly that is when I got bitten, yes.
So this is like the what not to do of being in tick country. But most people, again, think, oh, but Lyme disease, surely you must have noticed a tick bite.
So I had a red swelling on my neck. I did not see the tick. This happened at a time of year when I later learned ticks are in what's called their nymphal stage, when they're about the size of a poppy seed.
Right. There's a terrifying online thing where they show like a lemon poppy seed muffin that has a few ticks on it. Have you seen this?
No,
And it's like spot the tick.
this is triggering, pal.
I'm sorry.
No, that's about right. So it's very easy to get one, especially at that time of year, and not see the tick itself. I did have a red swelling that I was told by one of the first doctors I saw before I started to feel really sick was probably just a boil and would go away. I never got the bullseye rash. There is this conventional presentation of Lyme disease where you get a bullseye rash and then you get a fever. And then if you don't treat it, later you get joint pain. And having grown up in Connecticut, that was just sort of how I understood Lyme disease. But in fact, only about 50% of people get the bullseye rash. And the blood tests are early on only about 50% accurate. And the presentation of Lyme disease can be, it turns out, incredibly complex. And then there's this argument that's been going on for decades about what you do if the initial round of treatment doesn't get you better. And most people who get Lyme disease, 80%, let's say, take 4 to 6 weeks of antibiotics and mostly feel better. But a lot of people don't. And to put it mildly, doctors do not agree about what you do then.
All right. I want to get into the controversy in a minute, but just to go back to the symptoms for a moment, because what you described sounds kind of flu-like, right? It's a fever, it's joint aches. But earlier, when you were talking about it, you were talking about, nightmares and 1 hour of sleep a night. What were the symptoms actually like? And did you get brain fog?
So I got brain fog later on, deeper into some of the weirder things I did for treatment. What I got initially was this sort of baseline feeling of disintegration, which I think is fairly common with people who have chronic illnesses. One writer compared it to feeling like every cell of her body was somehow dissolving. And to me, it felt sort of how you feel like in the last day of a fever when your body is disassociated from yourself. So that was sort of the baseline. But then there was pain like just moving around, really severe pain in my shoulder one day, in my ankle the next day, inside my throat, my chest, hence the feeling that, oh, this must be a heart attack. Or, I would wake up in the night feeling like my throat was closing up. And the medical system is based around specialization. So you have stomach problems, you go to a gastroenterologist. You have chest pain, you go to a cardiac specialist. And in fact, Lyme disease, it's not the only disease that does this, but it gets in everywhere, basically, and causes weird symptoms all over your systems, and particularly in your muscles and joints. Then once I started taking antibiotics, I stabilized. The dissolving feeling went away. The sleeplessness went away, but the pain just stayed. There was just always this kind of migratory pain that basically, this is not something I had ever understood before, but your body can sort of feel like a cage, right? That you're trapped inside. And that was how I felt 5 to 6 days out of 7 every week.
All right. You mentioned before that after 4 to 6 weeks of antibiotic treatment, most people get better. Tell us a little bit about what long-term Lyme is for those who don't get better after that initial 4 to 6 weeks of antibiotic treatment.
I mean, basically, it's just the persistence of these strange, various symptoms without relief or with periodic relief and then relapse across months and years. And it varies from person to person. There are people for whom it takes the form of terrible exhaustion, just can't get out of bed, people who have terrible brain fog. Amy Tan, the Joy Luck Club novelist, had chronic Lyme disease and wrote about it as, she would drive to the grocery store and forget what city she was in, forget how to get home. So that it can have these strong mental symptoms. But again, in my case, it was mostly physical pain. And I was fortunate, as horrible as the pain was, that for the most part, my mind continued to work, which enabled me to continue writing newspaper columns for this newspaper. And, readers of those columns from 2016 or so can go back and judge for themselves, I guess, how much my mind was affected.
But you grew up in Connecticut. You were not unfamiliar with Lyme disease. I'm curious, as before you had Lyme yourself, what did you think of this idea of long-term Lyme, which falls into this kind of general family of diseases that are kind of looked at with a jaundiced skeptical eye, like fibromyalgia, like chronic fatigue syndrome. There's this question mark around it. Does it really exist? Are these people pretending? Is it psychological? What did you think before you had it?
I mean, I guess I would say that to the extent that I had a clear opinion, there is some chronic illness in my family. And having known people who were chronically ill, I generally tended to think it was real. Like I was not the kind of person who said, oh, you're just tired and malingering or complaining or something. But I also assumed that it wasn't actually that bad, I guess, right? That it's like, oh, it's sort of like a Victorian woman on a fainting couch, right? And in fact, depictions of chronic illness are often gendered in this way, where it's like assumed to be this woman problem that's kind of mysterious. And that's something that you see once you get deep into the culture of chronic illness and the debates about how it's treated. Traditionally, it's often been male doctors telling female patients that these diseases are all in their head. I was relatively open-minded at an intellectual level to the possibility that there are diseases that existing medical science doesn't know how to treat. What I was not prepared for was actually just how bad these diseases could be, and also just how extreme, when you have something like this, you can be willing to get, right? So eventually, I followed what is the outsider medical approach to treating chronic Lyme, which is to take lots of antibiotics over a long period of time. And that is the core thing that eventually helped me get better. But I went to extremes. I took more antibiotics than even my outsider doctors recommended. I did things like have a chiropractor put magnets on your body. You go and get IV vitamin C from a nurse practitioner who has tarot cards all over her office.
Did you think you would ever get to this point?
No, when you tell yourself, this is sort of, there are these stages, right? Where in your first stage, you say, well, I'm sick, but I'm not that sick. I'm not the kind of person who's going to do that. And then you do that, right? And then you do that thing. And then you move on to the next stage. And I now have a frequency generator. It's actually sitting in the attic where I'm recording this podcast that generates sound frequencies that are alleged to shatter bacteria. And it's the kind of thing, if you read about it on the internet, it seems like the purest pseudoscience. And I never would have imagined myself trying it. But in the end, not only did I try it, I acquired such a box and used it periodically over a period of many years and actually found it tremendously helpful. And, when you tell this kind of story, and hopefully this works in the book, right? You're trying to strike a balance between, on the one hand, I want to persuade the skeptical reader that, one, chronic Lyme disease is real. Two, it can be treated. Three, it can be treated in a scientific manner that is not just like mystical and woo-woo. So I want to be persuasive on that point. But you also want to be true to the sheer weirdness of this experience, right? So like the strange things that you do and the even stranger fact that you do them and then they seem to work, right? So that's the hopefully successful balance of the narrative in the book.
All right. The strangeness of the treatment I want to talk about, but let's talk first about what drove you there. Describe in your own words, what did it feel like at its very worst?
At its very worst, it was this double prison, basically, where first your self is sort of trapped inside your body, and your body is always in pain. And you wake up with pain, you go to sleep with pain. You can never predict exactly what the pain is going to be from day to day. Lyme disease has been called the great imitator, which I think is a name they originally gave to syphilis, which similarly gives you symptoms all over your body. So when you have symptoms in your head, right, you get this pounding feeling that almost takes not almost, that like you get a sort of very temporary suicidal ideation, right? Where you're like, oh my God, I just want to kill myself. And that lasts mercifully for half an hour, and then it stops, and suddenly you're dealing with burning pain on the soles of your feet. So it's incredibly bizarre. Once you get a little better, the absurdity of it sort of becomes more apparent. But while you're in it, it's just like, my body is a prison. Every normal pleasure is gone. You can't just like eat a normal meal or collapse on the couch and watch TV without being constantly aware of your body in these straits. And then we were in this house, right? This like dream house in the country that was basically the Overlook Hotel for us, right? It was like I was a writer. My wife was pregnant with our third child, and then we had a baby. She's a writer too, so neither of us had anywhere to go. We were sort of trapped with each other. Everything we thought we liked about the place became frightening. We didn't want the kids to play outside or, go down to the field or anything like that. And, for my wife, it's like, okay, your husband, you trust your husband, you love your husband. He says he has this illness. There are doctors who agree he has this illness, but he can't get better from it. And you can't see the physical manifestations of it. He's just describing symptoms. They change every day. And so part of the drive to get better is just, you want relief from the symptoms, but you also want to prove that you can get better, right? To like prove to the people who love you that you aren't writing all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy on your laptop. You basically try and prove the reality of your illness by making it go away. That was what I felt like I needed to do. That if I got better, it would prove that I had really been sick.
How did this experience affect how you've reacted to news of COVID and to the treatment of it and to the medical profession generally?
Well, I was a COVID alarmist early because I sort of, did my own research on the internet and decided this was going to be bad before most other people had decided it would be bad. That did not prevent me from getting COVID early on while traveling on an earlier book tour. So that just goes to show you that, having foreknowledge of something doesn't necessarily help you. But then I've had a very mixed and complicated view of the COVID era because, first there was the period of deep uncertainty where, nobody really understood anything about the disease. And of course, if you've had a chronic illness, you've lived with that kind of uncertainty for longer periods of time. So that was familiar to me. And then so were the medical debates that quickly broke out, these distilled versions of the kind of controversies that I was familiar with. Then you had long haul COVID, right? So you have the chronic form of COVID, which has some clear similarities to chronic Lyme disease, but sort of swept on society much more suddenly, and so got a very different kind of response. But so I've been very interested in both talking to people who are dealing with that and writing about it a little bit.
Do you have the long form COVID?
I had the classic presentation of COVID at the start with shortness of breath, chest issues, and so on. That went away, and then I had weird COVID symptoms that were different from my Lyme symptoms that lasted till about August of that year. So that is technically long COVID, but then it went away. So it was one illness that my body was actually capable of clearing COVID seemingly in a way that it had struggled to clear Lyme. But I mean, the thing that I try and stress about COVID is that I have more sympathy than I would have before for people who are just deeply skeptical of the medical system, because my experience with the medical system with Lyme disease was pretty terrible. At the same time, you're trying not to let that skepticism curdle into a full rejectionism where you end up saying, because Anthony Fauci got these 3 things wrong, I'm not going to take the vaccine, right? Like I'm vaccinated. I think the vaccines work. I've done my own research. Right?
No doubt.
I think no doubt, right? And I think, so I got vaccinated. And I think there has to be a balance that you strike when you have this kind of weird experience that I've had, where you are able to say, look, I've been to the fringes. I know there are things on the fringes that are actually probably true that the establishment gets wrong. At the same time, I'm not going to live completely on the fringe and reject everything that the establishment has to offer, because official medicine does a lot of things incredibly well. I think that's clearly a tough balance for both individuals and cultures to strike.
So it's fitting that we're talking about COVID now, even though we started with Lyme, because you and I were scheduled to talk about your previous book on the podcast when the world shut down, went into lockdown. And so you were one of the 3 episodes that didn't happen of this podcast in 2020. And this is a very different book from that book and from all of your previous books. What was it like writing a memoir? How was the experience different from working on your much more argument-based, historically based, politically oriented books?
I mean, it's a strange thing to say about a book that's about a very harrowing experience with overtones of Stephen King, but it was a lot of fun to write. And part of that, I'm sure, is just the catharsis of spending many years as a writer, as a kind of quasi-public figure, writing constantly and never actually writing about the most important thing that was happening to me. So it's nice to have actually done that now. But also, it's a different kind of writing that has its own real pleasures. Like there is not really, like the book is, to the extent it works, is in part a sort of evocation of the New England landscape, the weird Stephen King meets Nathaniel Hawthorne vibes of beauty and horror that the Northeast of the United States somehow contains. It's a sort of psychological and spiritual and emotional portrait. And it's doing a lot of things that you just don't get to do when you're trying to analyze what happened in the, Virginia gubernatorial election. So I don't intend to write, God willing, nothing this interesting will ever happen to me again. So I don't intend to write more memoirs, but this kind of more literary writing is actually a great pleasure. And maybe I'll find a different way to do more of it in the future.
But that it doesn't involve you getting...
I'm not going to go infect myself with West Nile virus in order to produce
the deeper places.
Even deeper.
All right. The book, again, is called The Deep Places, A Memoir of Illness and Discovery by Ross Douthat. Ross, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
You've heard me talk before about our biggest list of the year, which comes out at the end of this month. It's the 10 best books of the year, 2021 in this case. And if you're a Time subscriber, we hope you'll join us on the morning of November 30th for a virtual live edition of this podcast where we'll announce the list for the very first time before it gets published. I'll be joined, of course, by my book review colleagues here and many of the people you know from the podcast, and also actor, writer, and producer Lena Waithe, who recently announced that she'll be starting her own book imprint, will kick us off with a welcome. Afterwards, like last year, we're holding a virtual after party where we want to hear from you about your favorite books published this year. You can RSVP at nytimes.com/10bestbooks. That's 10 TEN spelled out with letters. My colleague Elizabeth Egan joins us now to talk about her latest pick for group text. Liz, thanks for being here.
Pamela, thank you for having me.
Before we talk about your pick this month, which is called Oh Beautiful, let's pause for a moment, rewind a little bit, and talk about group text more generally, because maybe not all listeners are familiar with it. Maybe they missed earlier episodes in which you talked about it. Can you tell us about the concept here for this monthly feature and what makes a book a group text book?
A group text book is a book that is perfect to read with your book group. If you don't have a book group, it's a perfect book to read with a friend, with your mother, with your neighbor, and just casually compare notes. The idea is it's a casual book club, low commitment, no guilt. And I pick books that have a discussion-worthy hook, whether it's ambition, family, money, the future, the environment, something that you can sink your teeth into and have a robust conversation about. And once the review comes out, 2 weeks later, I do an Instagram live with the author where we invite people to come, readers to come and ask questions about the book.
Are all of your group text endorsements? Like, are you essentially saying all of these are great books or at least good enough?
I'm saying all of these are good books to talk about with somebody. I do include some criticism in my reviews. I don't think they're all perfect books by any means, but I actually think that's something that makes a book almost more fun to discuss. I mean, is there any such thing as a perfect book? Actually in Oh Beautiful, which I'm about to talk to you about, I thought there was too much in this book. There were certain plot threads I might have removed. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I really look forward to talking about it with people. But I think with any book, we're all critical people in this line of work. I can usually point to something that I might have adjusted, but there's still plenty to talk about and mull over with friends or whoever you're talking with about it.
One more general group text question. So you're picking these almost every month. Occasionally, you might skip a month if there's nothing you feel truly enthusiastic about or think is worthy of discussion. Do you look at these books collectively and say, okay, last month I did a thriller and this month I need something more serious? Or is it really month to month you're kind of trying to find the best discussion-worthy book?
It's a little bit of both. I tend to be drawn like a magnet to certain types of depressing family stories.
This is why we get along.
Exactly. I don't quite know what it says about me. Maybe it makes me feel better about my own life, but I do have to check myself to avoid getting pulled into the same domestic drama every single time. So I do look back over what I've written about in the past few months, and I also try not to always have the books take place in the same place. Like nobody wants to read 4 months in a row a story that takes place in Brooklyn. This month's book takes us to North Dakota. Last month's book took us to Colorado. I try to go a little further afield than my own backyard.
I feel like you also have a certain appetite for two other genres that I enjoy, the juicy thriller and the traumatizing memoir.
Guilty as charged. 100%. The more stressful and the more depressing, the better for me.
The more fun the conversation. No,
Yes, exactly.
a little bit. Well, let's talk about this month's pick, Oh Beautiful. What is this book? Who's it by? Is it a first book?
This is Young Yoon's second book. Her first book is a thriller called Shelter. And Oh Beautiful follows a young woman. Actually, she's a soon to be middle aged woman, a former model who has left that profession to pursue a career in journalism. She is sent to the oil fields of North Dakota on a reporting assignment that she inherited from her former teacher, who she has had a romantic relationship with. He's had to step aside from this article that he's writing because he's getting a hip replacement. And he sends her in his stead, and he sends her with lists, pre-scheduled interviews, lists of questions to cover while she's in North Dakota in this oil boom town looking for a story. And she's uniquely qualified to go to this town. It's called Avery, North Dakota, because she grew up somewhat nearby and is familiar with what the landscape looked like before the oil boom. And she gets there and quickly discovers that what Richard, her professor, has set up for her isn't really the story that she wants to tell. And she starts to unravel her own story, and it becomes a novel about insiders and outsiders and about this town that's completely ill-equipped for this influx of somewhat desperate people who are there to work and live in really, really unpleasant and sometimes dangerous conditions in order to have these jobs working on the oil fields. So we follow her as she builds her own story and gets the confidence to stand on her own 2 feet as a journalist. But it's also a story about her relationship with her sister, who still lives in the area, and they've had a somewhat rocky relationship. Another plot thread I have a weakness for is the sister story, which is well covered here.
Well, you said earlier that there's almost a little bit too much in this book. What makes you say that?
There's just a lot of action. There are a lot of characters. She interviews a lot of, her name is Eleanor Hansen, I should say. She interviews a lot of people for the story. And there are a bunch of threads, I don't want to give too much away, that I felt leads into this story that she's investigating that I felt kind of hit dead ends. But then again, if you're a reporter covering a big story, that's what happens.
All too realistic.
Yes, we all know that.
Are you drawn to books with journalist characters?
Absolutely. Are you?
Yeah, but I like movies with journalists too. They move faster. I like a good spotlight.
Oh, yes. That's one of my favorite movies. It's always interesting to see somebody at work. And usually when we're reading a book about a journalist, it tends to be somebody who's more of a veteran journalist. And what I love about Eleanor is that she's just getting started and she's gone back to school to get a journalism degree kind of later in life. And I'm always rooting for someone who gets a fresh start, not when they're 25 years old. And her fresh start is extremely complicated by this relationship she's had with her former teacher. She has a complicated relationship with her editor who has an entanglement with her former teacher. So you're really pulling for her to make this new career work.
How good a job does the book do in depicting a journalist? I mean, it got the dead ends right. What else?
It got the all consuming nature of following your nose. Eleanor has a sense that there's more to this world that Richard has tried to set up in advance of the trip. And she has that sense because she knows this world. And you see her alone at night in her hotel room, really struggling with what direction to take the story in, how to navigate this landscape that's both familiar to her and unfamiliar to her, how to tackle the really rampant sexism and sexual harassment and worse that she's encountering in this mostly male universe that she's dropped into. And you just see how all consuming it is. I've never been on the heels of a big story the way that she is here, but it's exactly how I would imagine it to be. And she's worried about her recording and making sure she takes good notes. And those are all things, even if you're someone who's mostly interviewing authors, those are all things you can relate to and you understand that stress.
Let's go back to the setting, North Dakota. Earlier, you mentioned how you like to find stories that take place in different parts of the world. And in your column this month, you write, Yoon's field trip to North Dakota provides an on-ramp onto conversations about racism, environmentalism, journalism, economics, and sisterhood. Tell us a little bit more about that. We talked about the journalism part. Maybe let's talk about the racism.
Eleanor is half Korean. Her father met her mother while he was stationed overseas in Korea. And she moved to the United States to be with him. And Eleanor and her sister grew up on an army base where her mother remained an outsider despite her efforts to put down roots in this place. And her mother eventually leaves when the girls are pretty young. So the book is also about missing her mother, about this unsteady alliance she formed with her sister in her mother's absence. And wherever Eleanor goes, she doesn't feel entirely American and she doesn't feel entirely Korean. And when she goes to North Dakota to report this story, she's not completely confident in her role as a reporter or a journalist. She's struggling with imposter syndrome in every area of her life. And in terms of the environment, there's almost a gold rush vibe to this town, but the gold is oil. And there are people sleeping, 6 men to a hotel room. Everywhere she goes is totally overcrowded. And in fact, she gets evicted from her hotel room at one point. I won't go into too much detail about that, but ends up spending some time sleeping in her car in a parking lot that is completely full of RVs and converted trucks where people are living and cooking in the parking lot at night and using a convenience store for groceries. There's sort of a nomad land vibe. She's also exploring the overcrowding and the land grab and the oil grab and the sense again of being an outsider there.
You just mentioned Nomadland, which was, of course, turned into a movie, but originally a book by the journalist Jessica Bruder. And you also recommend in the column, you compare it to that book and another nonfiction book by a journalist, Amity and Prosperity by Eliza Griswold. It's kind of interesting that you thought of two nonfiction books when looking for further reading.
I guess it is, but especially Amity and Prosperity read to me like a novel. And in fact, Eliza Griswold going to rural Pennsylvania to report on fracking in these two towns that are actually called Amity and Prosperity to report on the impact of fracking. Eleanor Hansen reminded me of Eliza Griswold, who I think of as a poet first and foremost.
And she is.
She is. And she brings this poet's eye to the telling of this unbelievable story. And she does it with a really light touch. It read in some ways like nonfiction in the same way that Eliza Griswold's book read as fiction. I think the best books sometimes leave you a little bit not confused, but maybe you get so drawn in, you almost forget, is this true or is this not true? And to me, that's the mark of a really good novel.
All right. So if you were actually in a completely functional, low-key book club, you didn't have to cook anything or clean up your house before a meeting or worry about COVID, and you were settling down to start talking about this book, what would you really want to know from fellow readers? What would you want to talk about?
I want to know which of the stories in this book spoke the most to them. Is it the environmental piece of it? Is it the sister piece of it? Is it the ambition piece of it? Is it the racism and sexism? There are so many different ways the conversation could go. I would just throw the floor open to see where people's minds went.
And when it got to your turn, what would you say was the part that really spoke most to you in this book?
Surprisingly to me, it was the sister piece of it, because Eleanor has been estranged from her sister, who lives a couple of hours away and eventually comes to Avery. And Eleanor is really reluctant to reestablish any relationship with her and soon realizes that her sister has an ulterior motive for being there, which I won't tell you about. But it just got under my skin. It felt like they had so much unfinished business, and that unfinished business remained at the end of the story, which I think is often the case with sisters and with family relationships. Not with my own sister, who is an avid fan of this podcast and listens every week. I just want to make that very clear. But the sister story it really touched me.
All right. Well, that leaves us with a lot to think about, and I think will pique many people's interest. Now I'm very curious. So hopefully they will all turn to this book, which is called Oh Beautiful by Young Yoon. And Liz, thanks so much for telling us about it.
Pamela, thank you so much for listening and for having me.
Liz Harris joins us now with some news from the literary world. Hey, Liz.
Hey, Pamela. So the National Book Awards were this week, which is one of the most prestigious literary prizes in the world, which can really change the trajectory of a book and an author's career. The award for fiction went to Jason Mott, who won for his novel Hell of a Book, which weaves together 3 different narrative threads. There's an account of a Black author's book tour, the story of a Black boy in the rural South, and a third character called the Kid, who is possibly imaginary. Mott is a poet as well as an author, and he said in his speech that his agent picked him out of the unsolicited slush pile 10 years ago, which is great. The nonfiction winner was Taya Miles, who won for All That She Carried, The Journey of Ashley Sack, a Black Family's Keepsake. The book traces the history of a family through a cotton sack that an enslaved woman gave to her daughter in the 19th century when they were about to be sold apart. Dr. Miles is a historian and a professor at Harvard, and one thing this book has been celebrated for is examining lives that traditional archives and traditional approaches to historical research suppress. The award for poetry went to Martin Espada for his book Floaters, which honors migrants who have drowned in the Rio Grande. The award for translated literature went to Winter in Sokcho, which is by Elisa Shua Duzapa, translated from French by Anissa Abbas-Higgins. That book is set in a South Korean resort in the off-season. And the award for young people's literature went to Last Night in Telegraph City by Melinda Lowe, which follows a queer 17-year-old in San Francisco's Chinatown during the Red Scare who is falling in love for the first time. So those are the big winners.
What was the event like? It was virtual, right?
Yeah, this was the second time they had to hold it completely virtually because of the pandemic. They had hoped earlier in the year that they might be able to do this one in person. It's usually at Cipriani Wall Street. They called it off. But I've never been, but you've been, right? What's it like usually?
I have been many times. It's really fun. I mean, the best part is cocktail hour, of course, because everyone's wandering around and chatting and you get to see people and meet people that you might not know and haven't seen in a long time. And that is followed by the dinner and awards, which is also obviously great and can be incredibly moving. I mean, John Lewis was up there, Bob Caro in recent years, talking about some of the big awards. Edmund White most recently got the big Literarian Award for his body of work. And it's sort of fun and glamorous. And there's a press pit where you'll be, Liz. And it's apparently super fun, even better over there. And you don't have to, wear uncomfortable shoes. And then people get up and they mingle before dessert. And then after, there's a dance party. And I have never stayed for the dance party. That's for a different demographic, I feel.
I would really like to see this dance party, though. The literary dance party. Can I watch?
Yeah. No, I feel like it's a mixed metaphor. I don't know. It's not quite an oxymoron, but I'm sure lots of things happen there that I just, I don't need to know about, but are probably fun. So next year, Liz, you'll be there and we will wave at one another from across the room and exchange gossip.
I'll see you at the dance party.
Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues Greg Coles and Andrew Lavalley. Hi, guys.
Hi, Pamela.
Hey, Pamela.
So, Greg, tell us what you're reading right now.
Well, I'm reading a novel that came out in 1990 called Resuscitation of a Hanged Man by Dennis Johnson. It is his fourth novel, and I think it was his last book before he became a big star a couple of years later with the story collection Jesus' Son. I'll tell you, even if you had stripped his name off the cover and anywhere else it appears, there's no way you wouldn't recognize this as a Dennis Johnson novel, because it's got that misfit pilgrim protagonist who's like a spiritual seeker at loose ends, who's kind of wild-eyed and ecstatic, and probably as a direct result of those things, also a little awkward, like people aren't sure how to react to him. In this book, that protagonist is Lenny English. He's a middle American everyman from Prairie, Kansas, who has survived a suicide attempt and ended up in Provincetown, Massachusetts, on the tip of Cape Cod in the off-season, where he falls in love with a lesbian and finds work as a radio DJ and a private eye, eventually trying to track down a local artist who's gone missing. And that's basically the whole storyline.
You basically told us the beginning, middle, and end is what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, the plot isn't really the thing in a Dennis Johnson novel. It's very voicey. It's all voice. You can tell the publisher was angling to make this his big breakthrough. The version I'm reading is a signed and numbered uncorrected proof, which is just a real bid for attention. And it makes sense because he was so talented and so cool and so much in the sweet spot of that era's literary voice. It's funny how when you get a little distance from an era, you can suddenly see all the commonalities that you might not have seen at the time. Like, oh, who realized Joe Jackson and Elvis Costello sounded so much alike? I guess that was the 80s. And so was Dennis Johnson, the 80s and the early 90s. And this book has a very similar vibe to like Robert Stone and Joy Williams and Don DeLillo, even as it carves out its own territory. But I also see why it didn't break through the way that Jesus' Son did, partly because it overworks some of its religious themes, and partly because even though English himself is this great tormented soul, there's something almost clinical or remote in his observations of the other characters, especially the gay characters. It's set in Provincetown, and there's a big gay community there, obviously, but the gay characters in this book come off as maybe too colorful, too sideshowy, but it's really fun and funny and beautiful and kind. If we have time, I'd love to read the opening paragraph. He came there in the off-season. So much was off. All bets were off. The last deal was off. His timing was off, or he wouldn't have come here at this moment. And also every second arc lamp along the peninsular highway was switched off. He'd been through several states along the turnpikes, through weary toll gates and strained mechanical restaurants, and by now he felt as if he'd crossed a hostile foreign land to reach this fog with nobody in it, only yellow lights blinking and yellow signs wandering past the car's windows silently. It goes on from there. He goes to a bar and gets drunk, all in this opening paragraph. He gets in a car crash. The cop comes, a cab driver comes to pick him up and tells him, "You made a wrong turn." And the paragraph ends, "English did not dispute this." And so there's a real comedy and a real warmth to this kind of lost soul. And it's of course a resurrection story. It's there in the title, and it's there, there are times that English intimates that maybe he did die in the suicide attempt, and that this is all some kind of afterlife. He feels called, maybe not to the priesthood, but he meets the love interest at Mass. Johnson is really working on all this stuff throughout.
That opening part that you read is just amazing. Just the use of the word off alone, it's really striking.
I've read Jesus' Son, of course, and his other story collection, the posthumous Largesse of the Sea Maiden, and his debut novel, Angels, and then he won a National Book Award for his novel Tree of Smoke, which I also read, and it's kind of a prequel of sorts to Angels, even though it's also entirely a standalone novel and a Vietnam novel. And I've read some of his nonfiction, but Dennis Johnson was really prolific, and there's a lot I haven't read, so this is just kind of going back and filling in gaps when I can. Andrew, what are you reading right now?
I am reading Our Country Friends by Gary Steingart, it just came out and it's getting a fair bit of attention as kind of being billed as a pandemic novel. And I think that is true. It's set during the pandemic. Basically, there is a main character who's a somewhat has-been novelist, and his wife and child kind of escape New York City during the pandemic to their house in the Hudson Valley. And they invite 3 old friends, one of this character's former students, and one character who is known only as the actor, to kind of ride out COVID with them. And it's about how these 6 months actually play out in their lives. So the pandemic is the backdrop, but it really is sort of about how their friendships evolve and change. And, some of these characters go way back with each other, and they have a lot of baggage with each other, and there's ways that they've wronged each other. There's relationships that they've shunted aside, and now they're all thrown together with not much else to do, and they have to deal with some of this stuff when it comes up. And there's also these other characters who are a little bit more on the outside who throw other wrenches into the plot. Steingart, he's written a lot of funny stuff, and he has a way of skewering the characters a little bit, even the one who seems to resemble him a little bit.
A little bit.
And I definitely found myself laughing, even at little descriptions of characters in passing. There's one reference to this guy's Los Angeles agent, and he describes her voice smooth and deceptively creamy, like a chilled chia seed parfait. And there's another character who he is sort of falling in love with, one of the other occupants of this estate, and he's spending time with her and is wondering if they're on a date but doesn't want to make it awkward. And there's a passage where it describes that, he had studiously avoided that type of incident his entire life and had many empty moleskin diaries to show for it. So there's a lot of things like that happen really quickly, but they help offset some of the heaviness that the book gets into, which is a little bit of a departure from some of Steingart's earlier work. The dinner parties are some of those places where it feels so real, like the descriptions of the food and also kind of the descriptions of the affectations of these big city people who are in this more rural setting, but they still want fancy things. Some of that hit a little too close to home for me.
Gary, of course, was a guest a couple weeks ago on the podcast, and I can't remember if this was in this segment or not, but I had a lot of fun decoding which towns in the lower Hudson Valley he was talking about for each thing. I was I see a little bit of Kingston over here, and over here we have Tivoli and little Upper Red Hook going on.
Yeah, exactly. There's even one character who is, I sort of realize with some regret, probably one who's closest to me, and he's this kind of globe-trotting, cool gentleman type. And there's even a reference to this shop in Hong Kong where he's bought gifts or something like that. And it's a shop that I remember going to all the time when I lived there.
I'm going to call you cool globetrotting guy now.
Yeah. Pamela, what are you reading?
So I recently read Richard Powers's The Overstory, just 4 years after everyone else read it. And of course, the book won the Pulitzer Prize. And I read it right after reading Bewilderment, his new novel. And he was a guest on this podcast to talk about that. And I started reading it in a very appropriate place, which was Yosemite. So I thought, when in Yosemite, what are you going to read about the Overstory? And you can see the giant sequoias on the cover of the book. I have to say, I don't remember the hardcover, what it looks like. I have the paperback, and it's one of the most beautiful covers I've seen in a long time. I'm going to talk about the things I like the cover. So what everybody had said for a long time was like, this is a book in which trees talk. And part of me was like, oh, that sounds cool, like in a Ent kind of Lord of the Rings way. But also maybe it sounds like something I wouldn't like. So that both drew and repelled me for a long time, and is maybe why I didn't read it sooner. But it's more than that. It's basically uses really, let's see, it's 8 different characters and their stories. It's 9, but one is a couple. And their family histories, and brings them all up to the present, to apocalyptic, they're cutting down all the trees moment that I guess we are still in. And there were things in the book that I really loved, a lot of facts that I enjoyed and didn't know. For example, did either of you read this book?
Yeah, I read it. I enjoyed it more than I'm sensing you did.
I did not.
Well, okay, I'm going to give away the most fun fact, which is that chestnut trees used to be all over the place in this country and are no longer. Did you know that, Greg?
I didn't know it until I read the overstory, no.
I have to say that was sort of my favorite fact. And I it's rare that I will interrupt a novel to go over to the internet and just dive into a subject. But I did that with the chestnut tree because I just thought it was so interesting. Like, you see roasted chestnuts on the streets of New York around this time of year, but where are those chestnuts coming from if they're all dead? Anyway, I liked that. And I liked there are scenes that take place at the crown of these giant trees that I found incredibly evocative. Not necessarily believable, but, they're the stories of people who protest quite actively the chopping down of trees by squatting in the tree.
Setting up platforms.
Yeah, and refusing to leave. And I've never watched news segments on those. I've never seen footage. I don't know if you have, but for me, it was really vivid. And I thought powerful and moving. And even a microscopic sliver of me was like, maybe I'll go move to the top of a tree for a while. I loved that part. What I did not love is I don't love books that are preachy or didactic or laden down with a message. I kind of feel like that's not what I want in a novel. There are ways to explore ideas through different means. I mean, whether it's Dickens and you're exploring social and economic issues through character and situation, or with Katie Kitamura with Intimacies, where it's just a little bit more subtle. But I felt like this was very much where op-ed and novel meet, which is in a dark bar that I don't go to. So that part I didn't love. I'm curious to hear what you thought about it, Greg.
I really liked it. It is undeniably tendentious. I mean, it has a strong point of view. It's very much an environmental novel. I feel like it caught an early wave of environmental novels coming out. And so I was willing to roll with that and just say, okay, this is his point of view and his message. It also came out right after a couple of big nonfiction books on trees and how amazing they are, the networks through the roots and how they help each other and send out chemical messages and things like that. And I feel like Powers incorporates a lot of that into this book. And so what I liked about it was the way that it took that stuff, all that kind of nonfiction knowledge that we are gleaning about trees now, and wove it into a really big, epic, fictional narrative that takes place. I mean, yes, there are these 8 storylines, human storylines intersecting with the trees, but it takes place outside the scope of human narrative time. I mean, it connects us to these entities, these trees that live for hundreds and hundreds, 800 years. And it's a perspective that fiction does not typically give you.
I agree with everything you just said. Everything, and you just said it much more eloquently than I would have, and forgotten that. But yes, that is correct. But okay, can I ask one thing though, and one editor to another? Did you also feel that it was just a teeny weeny bit long?
Yes. And I had some problems with the ending. I think that he tries to tie. Well, I don't know if you've reached the ending.
I'm done.
Okay. So I think that he casts the ending. It's an attempt to be optimistic and, everything's okay, where the story itself is not driving toward an optimistic ending. And I feel like that's kind of a cop-out in an attempt to appeal to the audience. it was too long. We could have gotten less of, I don't know if it's the biologist or the protester. I don't know which story you would trim or if you just kind of cut throughout. It felt a little bit long. He maybe knew that. Bewilderment came in at like 200 pages.
Yeah. Or maybe he was just tired after all that. One of the interesting stories was a fictionalized version of a real person who was a previous guest on the podcast, Suzanne Simard, who wrote Finding the Mother Tree, Discovering the Wisdom of the Forest. And she is one of the scientists who looked into inter-tree communication and the ways in which trees will communicate with one another through underground networks using mushrooms in some way and roots, things that go beyond my capacity for scientific understanding. But I think, is based in science. All right, let's run down the titles of the books we talked about today. Greg?
I'm reading Resuscitation of a Hanged Man by Dennis Johnson.
And I'm reading Our Country Friends by Gary Steingart.
And I read The Overstory by Richard Powers. Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.